Hi, everybody. So as I mentioned in class, this lecture that I'm recording now is replacing the lecture that was supposed to happen on Tuesday. Um, Obviously, the exam 2, is scheduled for Thursday of next week. And of course, you're responsible on that exam for everything we cover in this lecture. So with that being said, let's get started. Now, what we're going to do is change topics a little bit. In particular, for this lecture and for the next few lectures after exam 2, we're going to be talking about social influence, which is how we are influenced by other people. And we can consider this kind of the bread and butter of social psychology. I mean, after all, social psychology is the study of how we're influenced by other people. And so that's literally what we're going to be looking at for the next few weeks in this class. And we're going to start by talking about conformity. But before we do, I want to tell you a little bit of a story. This is kind of an infamous day in American history, March 16th, 1968. This is during the Vietnam War. At the time, things were not going quite so well. And in particular, Charlie Company had recently lost a well-respected commander, and they were kind of itching for revenge against the Vietnamese. And they were going into this village called My Lai. And they were told that when they got there in the morning, that all the women and children would have left to the market. And so the only people that would be left in this village would be military-aged men. That's what they were told. That's what they believed. And so they arrive in this village on that morning. And what they find, contrary to what they've been told, is that, in fact, there are virtually no military-aged men there at all. In fact, the entire village is basically women, children, and the elderly. Now, what happened over the next few hours is kind of a dark stain on American history, because what these American soldiers did is they started setting fires to the huts. They started scalping people. They started murdering innocent villagers, raping some of the women. And they did this to the children that were there as well. There happened to be a photographer that came across some of the aftermath of what was going on here. These are some of the pictures that photographer took. And these are atrocities that were committed. You could see slaughtered villagers, slaughtered children. And this was done by supposedly the good guys, the American soldiers, right? This is a famous picture that was taken that day. The soldiers would take old men. A couple of them threw an old man down a well, threw a grenade in after him. They were cutting off people's hands. At one point, they rounded up a bunch of people, a lot of the villagers, and put them in a ditch and opened fire on them with a machine gun. At one point, a small child, probably about 2 years old, escaped and started running away, and an American soldier grabbed that child, threw him back in the ditch, and shot him point blank. When this massacre was done, there are a couple different estimates of how many people died. I've seen estimates of about 374. I've seen a different estimate of about 514 people. Regardless, hundreds of people, and these are innocent people, right? These were not people in the military. These were just villagers, were slaughtered by American soldiers that day. In fact, this murderous rampage didn't end until another American soldier who was flying a helicopter landed his helicopter between the ditch where they had thrown all these people and the American soldiers who were shooting on them. So they landed his helicopter in between that, and he instructed the gunman on the helicopter to open fire on the Americans if they kept killing innocent civilians. And finally, that ended the slaughter that day. Obviously, we can't explain exactly what happened that day using just social psychology, right? There's probably a whole lot of factors that were at play that led to this massacre. But we can look to see what some of the soldiers there said about why they committed this atrocity and learn a little bit about that. So here's what a couple of them said. You didn't have to look for people to kill, they were just there. I cut their throats, cut off their hands, cut out their tongues, scalped them. I did it. A lot of people were doing it, and I just followed. I just lost all sense of direction. Or I killed about 8 people that day. I shot a couple of old men who were running away. I also shot some women and children. I would shoot them as they ran out of huts or tried to hide. Okay, now the key here is looking at this first paragraph where they said a lot of people were doing it and I just followed. That's part of the explanation the soldiers given for why they were committing murder in this case. Now, obviously there's a lot more going on here to explain why the soldiers killed these villagers. But at least part of an explanation, at least a small component of that explanation, seems to have something to do with conformity. that we went along with it because other people were doing it as well. And that's what we're going to focus on today, is the power of conformity to shape our behavior, to mold our behavior, to get us to act in ways that we think other people are acting. When we talk about conformity, what we're talking about is a change in our beliefs, or in particular, a change in our behaviors as a result of real or imagined group pressure. And I want to focus on that last part for just a second. What this means is that we'll often conform our behavior to what other people are doing to match the behaviors they're engaged in, but we'll conform to even imagined group pressure. So in other words, if we think everyone is performing a certain behavior, even if they're not, then we can change our behavior to match that as well. And there are a number of studies, social psychological studies, that have shown that people will conform to what they think other people are doing, even if they're not actually doing that. So let's take a look at the history of conformity research in social psychology. Now, remember, in Western culture, we don't like to conform. When we talk about differences between Western and Eastern cultures, one of those differences was that in Western cultures, we tend not to like to conform, right? But we still conform all the time. I mean, how many of us can say we conform as little as this person here, right? We conform constantly in this culture in terms of the way that we dress, in terms of the way that we cut our hair, or even the slang that we use, the way that we speak, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We don't like to think that we conform. In Western cultures, we tend to be individualists, right? We tend not to like to think that we conform our behavior to others, but we do all the time. Now, of course, in Eastern cultures, they tend to have a bit more of a positive perspective on conformity. They tend to not mind conforming as much. But the point is that in this culture, even though we don't like to think that we conform, we still do constantly. And that's partly because the pressures to conform are extreme. It's very uncomfortable for us to not conform our behavior to that of others. And I'll give you an example. This was a study done decades ago, probably back in the 50s or so. And the purpose of the study isn't really the main point I want to make, but what they were doing in this study was research assistants would go onto the subway in New York City, and they would simply go up to people and ask them, "Excuse me, can I have your seat?" They just wanted to see if people would sort of mindlessly give up their seat. That's not really the focus of why I'm telling you this story, though. Why I'm telling you this is because what the researchers reported after the fact is that these research assistants hated this study. They hated collecting data on the study because it required them to go up to random people and ask them for their seat. And that's not something that you do, especially not on the New York subway. And a lot of these research assistants would report getting sometimes physically ill prior to having to conduct the study because it was so uncomfortable for them to have to do something out of the norm, out of the sort of unwritten social rules that dictate how we behave. Asking someone for their seat is sort of contradicting those unwritten social rules, and it made them extraordinarily uncomfortable to the point where they got physically ill. That's how strong the pressure to conform to, in this case, these unwritten rules is, that if they don't conform, they can get physically ill. So the first study I want to talk about is a study that was done back in the 1930s by a researcher by the name of Muzafer Sherif. Here's what he did. He wanted to look at how group norms, in other words, the unwritten rules that dictate how a group behaves, how those norms would arise sort of naturally. And so here's what he did. He brought people into a laboratory and he put them in a dark room where there was only a single point of light. So it looks something like this. Now, there's a phenomenon, an illusion called the autokinetic effect, whereby if you look at a point of light in an otherwise dark room, after a little while, it starts to look like that point of light moves. So even though in reality it's actually completely stationary, our brains see this point of light as moving a little bit. So Sharif took advantage of this tendency, this autokinetic effect. And what he did is he would ask people to look at that point of light for a little while. Then after a little while, he would ask them, okay, now how far did that point of light move? And people would give an estimate. Maybe they would say it moved 6 inches to the right, or it moved 3 inches to the left, or something like that. And of course, different people give different estimates because it's all an illusion. But everyone tends to fall prey to this illusion. So everyone thinks that that light moves a little bit. Okay, that was on day one. People did this individually. And then what he would do is he brought them back for a second day. And on the second day, he created groups of 3 participants. So he took 3 people who had already participated at day one, put them together in a room, had them look at a point of light, and then asked each person individually how far they think that point of light moved. But what that means is that each person responded out loud. So the second person to respond heard what the first person's estimate was, and the third person heard what the first two people's estimates were. And he wanted to know whether these estimates would start to converge over time. In other words, whether my estimate of how far that point of light moved was influenced by the estimates that the other participants gave. And so what I'm going to show you on the next slide is the average distance that people thought that point of light moved across day 1 and day 2. And they repeated this process on a couple of other sessions as well. But this pre-group session refers to when people were estimating how far that point of light moved individually. So this is some sample data from 3 participants, participant A, B, and C. And you can see that on the first day, when people were giving individual estimates of how far that point of light moved, they would give fairly different estimates, right? So participant A estimated on average that the point of light moved about 7.5 inches. Participant B estimated it moved about 2 inches. Participant C estimated it moved about 1 inch. But you can see that when they were put in the group setting, those estimates start to converge on one another. And they start to converge even more by the second group session, and then by the third group session, they're all basically giving the exact same estimate. So in this case, within this group, that estimate tended to be about 2.5 inches. But a different group of 3 people, maybe their estimates would start to converge at about 5 inches or something like that, right? So the point is that people's estimates of how far this point of light moved were biased, were affected by the estimates that other people were giving. In other words, people's estimates were converging, right? There was sort of this unwritten group norm that was evolving within a given group that dictated how far you're supposed to say that point of light moved. So what he concluded is that these group norms that automatically developed within each individual group influenced individual behavior. Now, it's kind of a key point to note that the participants didn't know that their estimates were being influenced by others. So if I'm a participant in one of these groups and I say the point of light moved 5 inches, I don't know that that estimate was influenced by the people who came before me, but it sort of automatically tended to occur. And this was kind of a landmark study at the time, but it left open an important question that wasn't studied until the 1950s, which was the following. In this original Musafer Sharif study, as I said, people didn't know that their estimates were conforming to those of others. But a different researcher came along named Solomon Ash, and he asked the following question. What if people knew that in order to conform, they had to give an incorrect answer? So in other words, let's place people in a situation and force them to choose. They can either give what they know to be the correct answer, but in doing so, they'd have to go against what everyone else said, or they'd be able to, or they'd conform to what other people said, but in doing so, they'd knowingly give a wrong answer. So what would people choose? Would people choose to give the correct answer, or would they choose to conform and give a knowingly incorrect answer? And that led to one of the most famous studies in all of social psychology, probably in the top 2 or 3 most famous studies. I want to describe to you what the study is. Okay, so what happened is this. Imagine you're a participant in this study. So you show up to a lab, and when you get there, there are about 6 other people in the room seated around a table. And there's one spot left, so you grab that last spot. And once you're there, the experimenter starts explaining to you what the study is all about. So in particular, he says, this is a study looking at people's ability to judge the length of lines. And so in a moment, I'm going to show you a picture. On this picture, there's going to be one standard line that looks like this, and there's going to be 3 comparison lines. The comparison lines are all different lengths, and all you have to do is tell me which of these 3 comparison lines is the same length as the standard line. And you should be able to see that this is a really easy task, right? So obviously in this case, line B is the same length as the standard line. So let's say this is the first, like he has these big cards at the front of the room. So he shows this big card to people. Let's say this is the first one that he shows. And what the experimenter does, he starts on one end of the table and he asks the first person for their response. And so let's say the first person says line B. Then he asks the second person and they say line B. And he asks the third person and they say line B. And the fourth person, the fifth person. And then he asks you and you say line B. And then he asks the last person. Okay. And for the first, and then he's going to repeat this process maybe about 20 times. And for the first few trials, everything goes as planned. But then on around trial 3 or 4, something weird happens. So imagine, again, this is the card that they show. So they show this on trial 3. And he asks the first person, which of these comparison lines matches the standard line? And the first person says line A. And you're thinking, line A, oh, clearly it's not line A, right? And then the second person says line A. Then he asks the third person, they say line A. And the fourth person says line A. And the fifth person says line A. And now it's your turn. Are you going to go along with what everyone else said, which is line A, but in doing so, give a knowingly wrong answer? Or are you going to give the answer you know to be correct, which is line B, but you have to go against what all the other participants had set up until that point? Now, if you haven't figured this out, the other people who you thought were participants are all confederates of the experimenter. They're all people who are working with the experimenter. And they've been instructed to give the same wrong answer on certain trials. Okay, so this is one of those trials that they're giving a wrong answer to. And of course, the question is, which of these 3 comparison lines are you going to say is the same length as the standard line? So this is a picture of one participant going through the experiment. This is the researcher at the front of the class. This is the card that has the standard line and the comparison lines. And you can see that this is the one real participant at the table. And so every time the researcher asks people to say which length or which line is the same length as the standard line, he's always starting on this end of the table. So by the time he gets to you, 5 other participants have already responded to which line they believe is the same length as the standard line. Okay. So the question is, will this participant, will the one real participant here, will they give the correct answer or will they conform with everybody else and give the wrong answer? Well, on average, people conformed about 37% of the time. So remember, they repeated this process multiple times for every participant. And so on average, people conformed about 37% of the time. They don't conform all the time, but they conform a lot more than they would had they been giving these responses by themselves, because obviously this is an easy task. People know what the correct answer is. But if you look at the data by individual participants, what you find is that about 3/4 of people conformed at least once, okay? Meaning, or I guess that would suggest that if we were to conduct this study among you guys, among my class, about 3/4 of you would conform, would give a knowingly wrong answer at least one time, just because other people gave that same wrong answer. Okay, that's how strong these pressures are to conform. And this surprises people, because if you were to ask people to predict the outcome of this study prior to knowing about it, most people might think that some other people might conform, but the majority of people think, I wouldn't conform. I'm not the type of person to conform. What the study shows is that the majority of people will conform if you put them in a situation where they have to choose between conforming and giving the wrong answer or not conforming and giving the correct answer. So we conform all the time, right? Even the idea that we're nonconformists can, in a sense, result in conforming to that subculture. There's an old South Park episode that deals with this, where I believe it's Stan, which is one of the main South Park kids, wants to join the goth group. Okay, and they tell them that, look, we don't conform to society. Okay, we do whatever we want. But in order to join our group, you've got to dress like us and listen to the same music we do and write the same type of poetry that we do. So in other words, in order to join this group of nonconformists, you've got to conform to what we do within this group. We tend to conform a lot within this culture. So this raises an obvious question, which is, why is it that we conform? What is the motivation we have to give a wrong answer, to conform with other people. And there's really two main motivations that have been identified, or two main reasons why people tend to conform. The first is due to what's known as informational influence. Informational influence occurs when we conform to what other people are doing because we don't know what the correct answer is. And we believe that other people do, and they're correct with whatever behavior they're engaging in. And so we conform our behavior because we want to be correct as well. So this happens under times of uncertainty, right? Where we don't know what the correct behavior is. So maybe you're traveling, for instance, and you're in a foreign country you've never been to before, and you don't speak the language. And maybe in the middle of the night in your hotel room, some alarm goes off and you don't know what it means. And you look outside your hotel room door and you see people running to get out of that hotel. Now, you don't know what's happening, right? But you could probably assume that other people do know what's happening. And so you're probably going to run out of that hotel as well, right? You're conforming your behavior to other people because you assume they know what the correct behavior is. And we want to be correct as well. So that's an example of informational influence. So as I alluded to, this is common under ambiguous situations where we don't know what the correct behavior is. And this is a general theme that we've seen before in this class. We're going to see again in this class, that when we don't know what the correct behavior is, one of the first things that we do is we look to other people. What are other people doing? And we'll often model our behavior after them. So we'll often conform our behavior to other people. So there's a famous book that I'm sure you've heard of called War of the Worlds, written by H.G. Wells. This is about basically an alien invasion. A number of years ago, this was made into a movie with Tom Cruise. But this book came out a long, long time ago. But later on, the famous director Orson Welles, he put on a radio broadcast of War of the Worlds. But he did things a little differently than how these radio broadcasts were done before. So what he did is he started off at the top of the hour with just regular radio programming. So they'd have a little bit of music and maybe have a little bit of news, or they'd talk a little bit about the weather. Then after a couple minutes, this news reporter would break in with a breaking story. And they would say something like, we have breaking news. Scientists have just seen explosions on Mars. Stay tuned for more information. And this was framed as if it was a real news story. And this had not been a technique that people had been exposed to at the time. So people believed that this was a real news story. And then a few minutes later, the same reporter would break in again and say something like, something has landed in this park outside New Jersey. I think it was outside New Jersey this took place. Stay tuned for more information. And now if you're listening to this program, you're really interested as to what on earth is going on. And a few minutes later, they break in again and say, okay, we're here on the scene with what looks like a spaceship that has just landed in a field. And oh my God, they're opening the doors and aliens are coming out. And oh my God, they have ray guns and they're shooting people and it's pandemonium over here. And again, this is all framed as if it's a real news story. So imagine you're one of these people that's listening to the radio, okay, and you hear this happening. And you're unsure as to what's happening. Like, is there an alien invasion happening right now? And so we don't really know what to do. So we look out the window. And let's say that you look out the window to see what are other people reacting to this? What are your neighbors doing? And you see one neighbor packing up his car with all his belongings and his family to try to get out of town. And it's also been reported on this news program that they're releasing these poisonous gases into the air. And so you see another neighbor wrapping a wet towel around his face to try to protect himself from the poisonous gases. And you see another neighbor running down the street in his underwear screaming that it's the end of the world. Now, what's going to happen when you see all this occur, right? You're going to start to think, oh my God, there must really be something going on here. And you start freaking out, right? And you start wrapping a towel around your head and you start packing your car to get out of town. And then your other neighbor who's listening to the same program looks out their window to try to figure out what's going on. And they see you wrapping a towel around your head. So they start wrapping a towel around their head. And this chain reaction occurs where as soon as one person starts freaking out, that causes other people to freak out, which causes other people to freak out. And next thing you knew, there's mass pandemonium, mass hysteria because of this radio program. And this all occurred due to informational influence. And when this happened, by the way, there were people who were forming posses that would take rifles, and they were going to try to fight off the aliens. They started shooting at a water tower at one point, thinking it was an alien ship. And it was all due to conformity as a result of informational influence. People just wanted to engage in the correct behavior. The motivation here is to be accurate, right? We want to engage in the correct, the right behavior. And so in this case, we conformed our behavior in order to try to be accurate. There's a little bit of informational influence going on in the original ASH study. So when they asked people after that study, why did you say that line A was the same length as the standard line when in fact it was obvious that it was line B? And some of the participants said things like, well, I assumed that I had just misheard the instructions. I mean, after all, if everyone is giving the same wrong answer, it's more likely that they understood the instructions and I didn't. So maybe what we had to do was judge not the length of the lines, but the width of the lines, and I had misheard it. And so that's why I conformed. So the idea here is we conformed in order to give an accurate response, okay? Because we believe that other people were giving accurate responses. But informational influence is not the only reason that people conformed in that study. It's probably not even the main reason. A second reason why people conform is due to what's called normative influence. This is influence that occurs when we're not trying to be accurate, but rather we're trying to avoid the negative social consequences of not conforming. In other words, we know that socially other people like it when we conform. Okay? And as a consequence, there's these negative social consequences that exist when we don't conform our behavior to that of others. And we know that. So in order to avoid having other people think negatively of us when we don't conform, we'll conform our behavior. This is something that Calvin learned when he wears his pants on his head and his shirt on his feet. It's sad how some people can't handle a little variety. What he's saying basically is that, or what he's implying is that other people did not really take too kindly to him wearing his pants on his head because it's not conforming to our standards of how people should wear clothes in society, right? And so we know this. We know that there's these negative social consequences. So we conform our behavior to others to avoid those negative social consequences. There's a movie from the 90s called The Program. This is about a college football team, basically. And there is a scene when this movie came out, near the beginning of the movie, where the rookie players were basically being initiated, or being hazed on this team. What they had to do was go to a highway in the middle of the night and lie down on the dotted line in the middle of the road. Okay? And so these cars are whipping by them, right? Obviously, it's pretty terrifying if you have to do this. But if you were to watch this movie now, you won't see this scene. And the reason you won't see the scene is because it was taken out of the movie. And the reason it was taken out of the movie is because people in real life started imitating this. There were groups of people who would go out and lie in the middle of the road on the dotted line while cars are whipping by, and some of them got hit by cars and some of them died. And so they took that scene out of the movie. Now, what would compel someone to do that, right? Well, part of what might compel them to do that is normative influence. So if you get a group of people, a group of friends who are all challenging each other to go do this, and all your friends are lying in the middle of the road while these cars are whipping by, and if you don't do it, there's negative social consequences associated with that within your group of friends. Right? And so to avoid those negative social consequences, your friends might make fun of you if you don't conform, right? If you don't do what they're doing. People tended to go along with it a lot of the time and lie in the middle of the road. That's how strong normative influence can be, is that in order to avoid negative social consequences, people put their lives at risk and lied in the middle of a road just to avoid these negative social consequences. That's how strong they are in potentially influencing our behavior. The motivation in this case is to be liked. So when we talk about informational influence, the motivation was to be accurate, right? But for normative influence, that's not the case. Our motivation is simply to be liked, or to avoid the negative social consequences. So what this means is that people will even give wrong answers or engage in behavior that they don't want to engage in just to avoid those negative social consequences. And this is likely what was happening with a lot of the participants in the ASH study. A lot of them knew that the correct answer was, let's say, line B was the same length as a standard line. They knew that, but they knew that by giving that answer, it's kind of awkward because the other 5 or 6 people are all giving the same different answer, and they might think negatively of you. So just to avoid those negative social consequences, a lot of participants gave a knowingly wrong answer. With respect to these negative social consequences, I think that we see this to some extent recently with Colin Kaepernick. So this is the football player that during the national anthem would kneel. This was in support of Black Lives Matter and that sort of thing. And when this happened, there was a lot of criticism of him. And there's numerous reasons for that criticism. A lot of it is political and things like that. But I think that one of the reasons for the criticism was that he wasn't conforming to our ideas of what people should do during the national anthem, which is to stand, of course. Now, he wasn't making anyone else kneel, right? This was just its own sort of private protest. So why should the rest of us care if he decides to protest that way, right? What does it matter for everybody else? And yet he had all this negative criticism. And I think that a lot of the reason for that, or part of the reason for that anyway, is that he wasn't conforming to our ideas of how people should behave. And we just don't like it when people don't conform. We criticize people who don't conform to our standards of how we think people should behave. And this idea that we don't like it when people don't conform is exemplified in the Johnny Rocco study. This is a study where participants were told about a juvenile delinquent named Johnny Rocco. And they were told that Johnny Rocco has recently gotten into a little bit of trouble with the law. He was caught like vandalizing property or something along those lines. And what participants had to do is, in groups of about 7 participants or so, is discuss this case and decide on a punishment for Johnny Rocco. So they could decide that he should go to prison if they want to be really harsh, or that he should be on probation, or he should be given a fine, or he should be given a warning, or something along those lines. So the group had to discuss what punishment they thought was appropriate for Johnny Rocco. But within this group of 7 people, there were 3 Confederates, 3 people who were pretending to be participants, but in reality, they were working with the experimenter. And I'll describe each of these 3 types of Confederates. One was called the mode. Now, the word mode is a statistical term, which just means the most common response. So the role of the mode within that group was to agree with the group majority. So in other words, if the rest of the group was deciding, we think that a fine is appropriate for Johnny Rocco, then the mode simply went along with the group. If the majority of the group thought that prison time was appropriate, the mode went along with that, with the majority of the group. Okay, so the mode basically always conformed with the real participants in the group. A second type of Confederate was the deviate. The deviate was the opposite of the mode. Since the mode agreed with everybody, the deviate always disagreed with everybody. So if the group wanted a fine for Johnny Rocco, the deviate would say, no, I want prison time. And if the group wanted prison time, then excuse me, the deviate would say, no, just a fine or something like that, right? So they'd always disagree with the group majority. They were sort of the anti-conformity Confederate. And the third type of Confederate was called the slider. And the slider initially started off like the deviate in that they started off disagreeing with the group, but over the group discussion, the slider would change their opinion to agree with the group majority. So after the group discussed what punishment they thought was appropriate for Johnny Rocco, they were all separated and they all filled out questionnaires about the other people in that group. And they answered questions like, did you like being in this group? Did you like each of these individual people? Which person would you like to kick out of the group if you wanted to kick someone out, et cetera, et cetera. So the researchers could see whether people liked or disliked these 3 types of Confederates. And what they showed is that the conforming members were liked the best. In other words, people liked the mode. The mode agreed with them, right? They especially liked the slider because the slider started off disagreeing with us. And then over the course of discussion, they came to see the wisdom of our arguments and they came to agree with us. And we like that because that means that, we influenced them to agree with us. We made good arguments. It sort of satisfies our ego. We like feeling good about ourselves. And so people tended to really like the slider. but they hated the deviant. They wanted to kick the deviant out. They did not want to work with the deviant anymore. In other words, we liked people who conformed with us, and we didn't like people who didn't conform with us. In other words, there's these negative social consequences associated with not conforming. And because we're aware of those negative social consequences, we will often try to avoid them from ever happening in the first place by conforming our behavior to fit in with others. There are a number of factors that affect the likelihood of conforming. I want to talk about just a few of those factors. First, and maybe most obviously, is group size. In general, as you increase the size of the group, the number of people who are all engaging in the same behavior, that increases our likelihood of conforming until you get to about 3 or 4 or 5 people. After that point, conformity levels off. Meaning, if you have a group of 5 people that are all doing the same thing, you're more likely to conform to them than if there's a group of only 2 people doing the same thing. But if there's a group of 10 people, they're not really much more likely to get you to conform than a group of 5 people. So in other words, if we were to graph this in terms of your likelihood of conforming, and they've done studies, this is based on data that Ash collected in different variations of the study that I described to you. This is the percentage of people who conformed. And what you can see that as the group size increases, you increase the number of confederates who are all giving the same wrong answer, people were more likely to conform until you get to about 4 or 5 people, somewhere in there. And then it kind of levels off, right? People are no more likely to conform after you get to about 5 or 6 people. A second really important factor that determines our likelihood of conforming is the unanimity of the behavior. So in other words, if you've got a group of 5 people and they're all engaged in the exact same behavior, there's a unanimous, they're behaving unanimously in a sense, we're much more likely to conform than if that same group has one person who's dissenting. Okay. A single dissenter within a given group dramatically reduces conformity. And this is true regardless of the group size. This is true if you have 5 people or 10 people or 50 people. The presence of just one person who doesn't go along with the group can get you to be much less likely to conform. And so, for instance, a unanimous group of 5 people is more likely to get you to conform to their behavior than if you've got a group of, let's say, 20 people where 19 of them are all engaged in the same behavior and you have one dissenter. That single dissenter just drastically reduces your likelihood of conforming. And in Ash's study, he ran some variations of that study where he had 1 or 2 people who dissented. So in other words, where he had 4 people giving the same wrong answer in terms of which line matches the standard line, but they might have had 1 person who gave the correct answer. And the presence of that 1 person dramatically reduced the actual participants' likelihood of conforming, made them much more likely to give the correct response. Sort of like there's safety in numbers, right? You've got 1 other person, you're not alone facing the rest of the crowd. You've got at least 1 other person on your side, so you're much less likely to conform. You can sort of see this to some extent in the classic movie 12 Angry Men. This is a movie that's, the whole movie takes place in the jury room, and you've got a jury who's deliberating about the outcome of a defendant of a criminal case. And when they first take the vote at the beginning of the movie, 11 of the jury members think that he's guilty, and there's 1 person that thinks that he's not guilty. And over the course of the movie, it's all about the deliberations among these 12 jurors. And that 1 person, that 1 dissenter, gradually changes the minds of the rest of the jury. But having that 1 dissenter is really important because it sort of gives permission for other people to dissent as well. And you might have seen this in various contexts, right? Maybe you've gone to class when we actually had classes in person. Maybe you went to class and let's say there's an assignment due or something. And everyone's sitting there and no one's turning in their assignment at the beginning of class. And then 1 person turns in their assignment, and then all of a sudden everyone else starts walking up to turn in their assignment as well. It's like the floodgates open, right? What's happened here is that you're all conforming in the sense that you're all engaged in the same behavior, which is you're just sitting there waiting to turn in your assignment. And as soon as there's 1 dissenter, 1 person who breaks conformity by turning it in, that allows everybody else to turn it in as well. It dramatically reduces conformity. I've also seen this where, let's say you're watching some show or a play or something where there's like a live audience, And at the end of a scene, let's say, you're waiting to clap and you go to clap and no one's clapping. What do we do? Are we clapping now? And then you're not quite sure. And then one person claps and all of a sudden applause just breaks out everywhere, right? Because our natural tendency, again, is to conform to what everyone else is doing, which is we're not clapping yet until one person claps their hands and all of a sudden just applause breaks out, right? That gave you permission to clap, in other words. Third factor that affects our likelihood of conforming is the cohesion of the group. So how well the group likes each other and gets along with each other. The more important the group is to the group members, the greater is the conformity. So in other words, if you're part of a group where you like everybody, you're all friends with each other, say, or the group, you consider the group to be really important to your self-identity, we're likely to conform to that because we consider them to be important. If the group is not really important to you, we don't really care as much about the other group members. Maybe we don't care as much about what they think of us, and therefore might be less likely to conform for normative influence reasons. And this idea is going to be important when we later look at group processes. What we're going to look at is a process known as groupthink, whereby a number of individuals within a group are making a decision. And what we're going to see is that when that group is really cohesive, they tend to put pressure on each other to conform to a desired outcome. And that can lead people to make really, really bad decisions. And so what we see in the groupthink section is that when you have great group cohesion, people put pressure on each other to conform. And that's exactly what we're seeing here in the conformity section. Finally, there are also factors associated with the person that can make people more or less likely to conform as well. I'll talk about a couple of them just briefly. So I've already mentioned this, but the culture that we're a part of affects your likelihood of conforming. So we've seen that in Western cultures, we tend not to think highly of conformity, whereas in Eastern cultures, they're much more likely to conform because they don't think of it as the negative thing that we often do in Western cultures. So even though we are very likely to conform in Western cultures, people in Eastern cultures are even more likely to conform. Furthermore, we saw with self-monitoring, remember self-monitoring is our tendency to monitor the social situation and figure out how we should behave and to change our behavior to match that situation. So what that means is high self-monitors are more likely to conform because they're the ones who are looking at the situation to figure out how they should behave and how they should fit in their behavior with the behavior of other people as well. So high self-monitors are more likely to conform than our low self-monitors. Further, our likelihood of conforming is also based in part on our self-esteem. So if someone has really high self-esteem and they trust themselves, they're more likely to not conform, to dissent from the group. Whereas people with lower self-esteem who may not trust themselves in their own decisions are more likely to conform with others as well. Okay, so that is the lecture on conformity. Obviously, you need to know this for exam 2. So I will see you guys on Thursday for the second exam. Have a good one. Bye.